1990s, Washington Governor Booth Gardner and Energy Secretary James Watkins each received a curious package. It was a jar of mulberry jam with a label that read, "Warning, radioactive, do not eat." It wasn't a mystery where the jam came from, since the sender had included a letter. Norm Buskey was a physicist and oceanographer that was concerned about radiation escaping from the Hanford site. He'd been on a boat on the Columbia River when he saw the berries. They were ripe, and the river was high enough that he could reach them without even leaving his boat. In the letter he wrote, "This mulberry jam is a token of the future hazard of unidentified, uncontained, and unmanaged radioactivity at Hanford." So why were the mulberries radioactive? For 20 years, a reactor at Hanford called the N reactor produced plutonium, and each year 1 billion gallons of contaminated water would be discharged into nearby wastewater trenches. Yes, that's billion with a B, each year. One of the unlined trenches was less than 100 yards from the Columbia River. There's an underground spring, which Hanford workers refer to as the N Spring, that runs under the trenches. The roots of the mulberry bush would draw moisture up from the N Springs. That water contains about 900 times the safe drinking water concentration for strontium-90. Strontium-90 is a byproduct of plutonium production. Strontium-90 is a highly carcinogenic radioactive element that lodges into the bones of animals and people. The vegetation near the N Springs was off limits to the public, and signs were posted about the radioactive threat. But the Columbia River was open to the public, and Buskey didn't have to leave his boat to reach the berries. He made the jars, sent them off, and of course alerted the media. When stories of the mulberry jam hit newspapers and airwaves, there was a bit of a panic. People wanted to know how safe the agriculture from the area was. Washington is known for its apples, and growers didn't want to have the reputation of glowing fruit. If they got a bad rap, what would happen to Washington's agribusiness? Workers at Hanford were sent out in radiation suits to cut down every mulberry bush with a chainsaw. They picked up every branch, every berry, all the leaves, and placed them into 20 4x8 concrete containers. Those were taken to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. There, they were burned in the nation's only government-certified incinerator for low-level radioactive materials. Those ashes were then brought back to Hanford to be buried. All of this cost about $500,000. This is a fascinating story. There's the absurdness of the activist trying to get attention to his cause by mailing radioactive jam to government officials. Then there's how these mulberry bushes, meant to only be a symbol of contamination, became the focus of people's attention. The Department of Energy knew they were there, they knew their danger was low, but once the public found out, the Department of Energy felt they had to remove them. The way events played out, one would think the mulberry bushes were the only contamination on the site. The root cause, sorry for the pun, was the N Springs, which was still contaminated. Now, Buskey didn't want the bushes gone. He likened their removal to killing the messenger. The bushes weren't even the most contaminated plant life in the area. The jam itself wasn't even that dangerous. While each jar of jam contained 80 times more strontium-90 than is allowed for daily consumption, Buskey himself said that someone would have to eat an entire jar of the jam every day for a year for there to be much of a health risk. Before he mailed them out, he even took a taste. A one-time exposure to that level of strontium-90 wouldn't be dangerous, but continued exposure over time could be detrimental to someone's health. Buskey didn't advocate that the bushes be removed. He wanted to use them as an example of how Hanford could have more unidentified and uncontained radioactive material. Hanford's threat to the public health and the environment is due to radiation on the site. But that word, radiation, describes many things, and often the public doesn't really understand the risk around the different types of radiation and even the different types of exposure. So before we go any further with these podcasts, I wanted to explore radiation's effect on health. Welcome to Down by the River, Stories of Hanford. My name is Danny Noonan, and I'm with Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. Each month, we bring you stories from Hanford. Once a facility producing plutonium for the United States' nuclear weapons, now it's the site of the largest environmental cleanup project in the world. A lot of what they're cleaning up is radioactive material. To learn more about radiation, I contacted Dr. Stephen Gilbert. He's a toxicologist and board member at Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. He authored a book, A Small Dose of Toxicology, which is a great primer on different toxins we come across in our lives and includes a chapter about radiation.
So it's interesting to think about how we're all exposed to radiation. We are all exposed all the time to radiation, but mostly we're exposed to non-ionizing radiation as opposed to ionizing radiation. So non-ionizing radiation is stuff that comes from the sun, and we depend on radiation. Radiation is a great thing. That's how chlorophyll works. That's how plants work. That's how we get our energy. That's how we get our food. So we get a little suntan if we want. That's how we see. So all that's primarily from non-ionizing radiation, just like your Wi-Fi is, your cell phones, all that stuff is non-ionizing. And then you have ionizing radiation, and then you go to the dentist, you go to your doctor, you get an x-ray, you're exposed to ionizing radiation. And that's where all things nuclear come from, is from ionizing radiation. You have alpha, beta, gamma radiation from nuclear particles.
So radiation is everywhere, but what is it? Now, every tangible thing you see is made of atoms. At the center of each atom is the nucleus. The nucleus is made of two particles. There are protons, which carry a positive charge, and there are neutrons, which have no charge. Outside the nucleus are electrons, which carry a negative charge. The atom is kept together by the attraction of the negative electrons to the positive nucleus. You still with me? It's about to get exciting. Every element in the periodic table has a specific number of these protons and electrons. But sometimes an atom will gain or lose protons or electrons, which means it will have too many or too few. When this happens, the atom becomes unstable or radioactive. When it is unstable or radioactive, the atom is known as a radionuclide, radioactive isotope, or radioisotope. Now, these radioactive atoms want to become stable again. They really do. So they release energy until they get back to a balanced state. This process is known as radioactive decay, and this is where radiation comes from. So Steve mentioned there are three types of radiation: alpha, beta, and gamma. But what are the differences between them?
So the difference between alpha, beta, and gamma. So alpha particles are large. They're easily stopped by a piece of paper, or your skin will stop an alpha particle. So in that sense, they're not very hazardous. Plutonium is an alpha emitter. Beta particles have a little bit more deep penetration. You have to have a little piece of wood will stop beta particles. But you want to, they'll damage tissue between 1 and 2 to 3 centimeters. So that's why, for example, iodine-131, you swallow that stuff, it goes to the thyroid, it sits in the thyroid, will damage the thyroid cells very close to where they are, so they don't penetrate very far. And gamma particles are more your X-rays. They're very high-energy particles that go right through you. It takes lead to stop gamma rays, actually waves or rays. So you got alpha, beta, gamma, and they have different amounts of energy and different penetrabilities. They penetrate tissue and other materials differently.
So in review, radiation comes in three forms. Alpha and beta emit minute subatomic matter called particles. Alpha particles are heavy, travel small distances, and can be easily blocked. Beta particles are lighter and travel further. The third type, gamma, travels in the form of a wave. Due to this, it can only be stopped by something dense like lead. A further distinction is that there's ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. Non-ionizing radiation is sunlight, infrared, microwave, and radio waves. Ionizing radiation means there's enough energy to free electrons from atoms. These are more dangerous because it can directly damage cellular DNA and proteins, causing cell death or possibly cancer. Ionizing radiation occurs as alpha and beta particles as well as gamma radiation. While putting together this episode, I talked with Dr. Sandy Lawrence. He's a retired physician who teaches classes dealing with climate and with energy systems, including nuclear energy and nuclear waste. He teaches at local schools, community groups, and with an organization called Resources for Sustainable Communities, and also for Western Washington University's Academy of Lifelong Learning. While alpha, beta, and gamma radiation are the most common types of radiation, there's a fourth kind of radiation, neutron radiation. This is the radiation from a nuclear weapon or from nuclear power. I asked Sandy about this.
Neutrons, of course, are one of the two basic particles inside the nucleus of almost every atom. And neutron radiation is a type that's given off in the context of either fission or fusion. It's a neutron, of course, has no electrical charge, and therefore is not much slowed down by anything that it's exposed to. It can go through a considerable distance in lead or water or concrete, and therefore is probably the most penetrating of the radiation types, even more than gamma radiation. It has also one unique characteristic, that is, as opposed to all the other types of radiation, neutron radiation is the one type that can actually turn something else radioactive. So in the context of a nuclear reactor, for example, the neutron radiation is both embrittling or causing embrittlement of the steel, and at the same time is converting atoms or material in the steel and other components of the reactor radioactive themselves. The dilemma then is that you have a lot of material that needs to eventually be dealt with as radioactively hazardous.
Next, I asked Dr. Lawrence what happens when the body's exposed to radiation.
Yeah, but the other important thing to understand about radioisotopes is that they behave chemically very similarly to substances that are normally present in the human body. With strontium-90, for example, it is handled very much as we handle calcium. And since the chief repository of calcium in the human body, though not the only one, is in bones and teeth, then that's where the strontium tends to go, and therefore would pose risk, for example, of tissue degradation or even tumor formation in those particular tissues. With cesium-137 and some other isotopes of cesium, the target tissue, in a sense, is more muscle and other soft tissue. With other kinds of radiation, particularly with the alpha emitters, with plutonium and uranium, the risk is that of a hot particle, where a collection of atoms of one type, say plutonium-239, have collected and then are inhaled or ingested, but particularly inhaled. If they lodge in lung tissue, which is one of the targets for alpha emitters, then the lung, the liver, and some other sites are the target, then that one particle will stay in situ, stay in one place, and be releasing a lot of alpha particles in the very close vicinity. And that turns out to be very tumorigenic. That is something that could produce tumor.
The radioisotopes that Dr. Lawrence mentioned, strontium-90, iodine-131, cesium-137, are all byproducts of plutonium production. These naturally occurring elements, strontium, iodine, cesium, get transformed during plutonium production and become unstable elements. They give off radiation as they become stable again. With decades of plutonium production at Hanford, I asked Dr. Lawrence what types of radiation are out at the site.
Well, of the four kinds of radiation just mentioned, really all of them, of course, are going to be present there. Those radioisotopes that are produced in nuclear reactions that have a short half-life are not the chief concern in any sense. The prototype of that, I think, would be iodine-131, which has a half-life fairly close to 8 days. And the rule of thumb in assessing radiation risk of anything that's radioactive is that after 10 half-lives, when it's reduced to less than 1,000th of the original amount, that it's relatively safe. And after 20 half-lives, when it's reduced to a little bit less than 1/1,000,000th of its original quantity, that it's considered fairly safe. So in the case of iodine-131, for that short half-life, the 10 half-lives would be about 3 months, and 20 half-lives would be less than 6 months. So in half a year, really that's not the concern. If there's no ongoing fission taking place, for example, then the iodine-131 would be totally out of the picture, essentially. And that's what's true, for example, at Fukushima. If there's not any regaining of criticality, then there'll be no further production of iodine-131, and that's now a non-issue. The ones of greater concern are those that have a longer half-life, and the two primary ones would probably be cesium-137 and then strontium-90. I think people are more familiar with strontium-90. That was the one released on all the above-ground nuclear testing that took place before the Limited Test Ban Treaty decades ago. And so dentists in the United States were able to collect the deciduous or shed baby teeth of a large cohort and determine, based on the distribution of the strontium-90 in the enamel of the teeth, the actual years during which people were being exposed, and also the dosimetry, the amount to which they had been exposed. So strontium-90 has a half-life of close to 30 years, and cesium-137 as well. So 10 half-lives for these two particular isotopes is 300 years, and 20 half-lives, 600 years. So that's a long-term problem.
Now, the study that gauged radiation exposure from examining baby teeth was started in the late 1950s. It was done in response to all the nuclear testing the United States and the Soviet Union were conducting. Both countries were trying to make bigger and better bombs, and they wanted to test them. I spoke with Dr. Gilbert about this.
So nuclear testing occurred all around the world. Different countries, they developed their own nuclear weapons. But in the United States, the first nuclear test was at Trinity site outside of Alamogordo, New Mexico. And that was where the bomb that looked very similar to what was used over Nagasaki was first tested. And from that point, they tested, most of the testing was in a Nevada test site. It was outside Las Vegas. And if you're in Las Vegas, you get tired of gambling or seeing shows, you go to nuclear testing museums. They have a museum devoted to all the tests that were set off in Nevada. And if you go out there and take a tour of that site, you can see huge holes where they blasted this stuff off. The air blasts they set off, they were stopped, I believe it was 62 they stopped air blasts, right? Something like that. But those air blasts were stopped because the wind, it blows towards the East Coast. The wind blows toward the east, from west to east. And so they create a whole lot of downwinders. All the people that grew up in the 50s in the East Coast were essentially downwind of all the nuclear testing that went on in Nevada during that period.
Besides the United States and their 216 above-ground nuclear tests, and the Soviet Union and their 214 tests, the UK performed 21 and France had 46. Radiation will go wherever the wind blows, and scientists were concerned that the radioactive fallout was spreading around the world, landing on people, animals, and our food and water supplies. So a group in St. Louis had an idea about how to determine if the radiation from a nuclear test was affecting humans. Strontium-90 is chemically similar to calcium, and when ingested in food and water, it attaches itself to the bones and teeth. It is also radioactive and known to cause cancer. Since children naturally shed their baby teeth, scientists could collect those teeth and test them for strontium. This would give them an idea of how much nuclear fallout people were being exposed to. The scientists sent out word to schools that they were looking for baby teeth. Everyone that participated got a button with a drawing of a kid missing a front tooth and the words, "I gave my tooth to science," and an official membership card to the Operation Tooth Club. All very cute. And the study worked. The results of the study showed that children born in 1963 had 50 times as much strontium-90 in their teeth as children born in 1950. The study was very influential when President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were negotiating a ban on above-ground nuclear testing, a practice which both superpowers ended in 1963. They still tested weapons, but now they did it underground. The tooth study continued, and results showed a 50% decline in strontium-90 in children born in 1968 versus those born in 1963. But back to Hanford. Plutonium production caused a lot of radiation to be spread to the land and to the buildings out there. I asked Sandy what he thought of the contamination out there.
I think an appropriate level of concern about Hanford and some of the other nuclear waste repositories would be to be concerned about it as a policy issue, more so than any sense of personal hazard. One positive point that I could make about Hanford now is what I heard just yesterday, that they're having a record salmon run returning to the Hanford Reach, the best since, I guess, the 1930s. I would say also that there is not any significant evidence of off-site radiologic contamination, which is, of course, the major concern, the Columbia River being one of our major waterways up here in the Pacific Northwest. I think, again, it's going to be an incredibly expensive and prolonged process, getting all of that material under control and safely dealt with. But I think it is something that is technically feasible and needs to be better funded than it is now.
I want to emphasize what Dr. Lawrence said. Currently, there's no evidence of radiation leaving the Hanford site. This wasn't always the case, which is something we will cover in more depth in future episodes. But currently, there's no danger to living near, visiting, or drinking wine from the area. And people weren't only in danger from radiation leaving the site. During its 70-year run, many people worked at Hanford. There are 22 specific cancers that are linked with working at Hanford. Back in 1990, the United States passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. This allowed payment to people who were exposed to radiation while working for the U.S. and its nuclear weapons program. At first, it only covered people that worked there until 1972. Then it was extended to 1983. And just earlier this year, a recommendation was made by the Department of Labor's Advisory Board on Radiation and Worker Health to extend benefits to people that worked at Hanford up until 1990, when cleanup began. But even if you worked at Hanford during those years and you developed cancer, you still have to prove it was from working at Hanford, which is not always easy. In fact, only about half of the 26,000 claims from people working at Hanford have been approved as of October 2014. That means 13,000 people that worked at Hanford and developed cancer were unable to prove that it was from working there. So how does one prove what caused their cancer? While not asking him specifically about workers at Hanford, I asked Dr. Lawrence why do some people develop cancers and others don't?
A couple of points. One point. The first would simply be that the level of background radiation varies around the world. So some people, parts of Iran, for example, are exposed to much higher background levels, up to 50 millisieverts per year, which is obviously 25 times higher than here. Secondly, people probably differ in their genetic susceptibility to damage. There's a conception that people have that radiation is always genetic in its effect and that it's always going to cause tumor. And in truth, just any large molecule, any molecule at all, really can have its chemical bonds sundered by the effect of beta radiation or alpha radiation and so forth. So it's not just cancer that we're talking about. There are other effects that could be. It could be damaging muscle tissue or other tissue, et cetera, without causing actual cancer. The third thing would be that people have widely varying susceptibility based on their age, so that somebody who is very young, embryo or fetus, a young child, et cetera, would be at higher risk of any kind of radiation damage. The fourth thing would be is just that there's background occurrence of many different kinds of tumor, and just like radiation, cancer is not a unitary phenomenon. There are many totally different types of cancer types. And so since there is a background of all that taking place at variable rates in population, there is the tendency to look at small numbers and view them as more statistically significant than they really are.
So depending on where you live, you're exposed to different amounts of background radiation, which is naturally emitting from the Earth. Your age is also a factor. Young bodies are more susceptible to radiation. And then different people have different genetics. So there are many factors at work. I also talked with Dr. Gilbert about exposure.
So what's interesting about radiation exposure, it can become, very short term or you have longer term. And the thing you want to do with radiation, all forms of radiation, you want to reduce the exposure to them. So it comes on length of exposure. And quantifying and calculating how much radiation you're exposed to is difficult because different parts of the body, different tissues, react differently to radiation. But long term, it seems that if you're exposed to low levels of radiation for longer periods of time, you have an increased probability of cancer. For example, let's take plutonium. So plutonium I can hold plutonium in my hand because plutonium is an alpha emitter, and alpha particles are stopped very easily by a sheet of paper. But that's external exposure. So external exposure is one kind. If I take that plutonium and I inhale it, it gets in my lungs, that's a whole different matter. Because even an alpha particle will be right next to the DNA of a cell, continually bombard that with alpha particles because plutonium has a half-life of 10,000 years. That cell that's right next to that little tiny, itsy-bitsy, teeny-weeny particle of plutonium will eventually cause cancer. So you can get lung cancer from plutonium that would have almost no effect on you outside. So it's very important to know whether it's internal, external exposure to radiation, and almost any time of low-level exposure to radiation, you want to reduce it. Just like you want to reduce X-rays, you want to reduce your dental X-rays, your CT scans. You want to be careful with radiation because it is, particularly ionizing radiation, because it is damaging.
While I was talking to Dr. Lawrence, I asked him if there's anything about Hanford that ever surprised him.
If I've been surprised in any way by what's going on at Hanford, it was in a positive way by going for a tour about half a year ago with a group of people affiliated with WPSR. I would have to say that I was impressed at the professionalism of the people who were doing the tour with us, the number of people involved in this, and the description of the monitoring and extraction wells that are dealing with the contaminated groundwater problem. Now, this problem is not to be underestimated. From what I have read, the area of involvement is probably 200 square miles of groundwater. On the other hand, they're monitoring very carefully the area that's known to be contaminated, and then the area between that and the river, the Columbia River. And so far, there's not been evidence that there's been any significant contamination of the water. So there is a reasonable expectation that they should be able to accomplish exactly what they are saying.
What Dr. Lawrence was referring to is a system called pump and treat. A large amount of contamination made it to the groundwater at Hanford. According to the Department of Ecology, there's a 170 square mile area of contaminated groundwater. 80 square miles of that is contaminated at levels higher than allowed for drinking water. To prevent that from getting to the Columbia River, a system was developed to pump out the water, remove the radioisotopes, and then put the water back into the ground. This technology was designed especially for work at Hanford, and the results are better than expected. This is one of the many, many projects happening at Hanford to remediate the site. This is happening along with demolishing buildings, removing contaminated soil, and hopefully coming up with a system to deal with the 56 million gallons of highly radioactive waste in 177 underground tanks. And this work is important, not only because of the environmental danger it poses, but because we have a responsibility to do it, which is something I talked with Dr. Gilbert about.
So, one thing I want to mention is I think we all have a moral obligation when it comes to nuclear weapons, nuclear testing, and the use of nuclear materials. Because World War II, 70 years ago this year, 1945, there were 3 nuclear weapons set off in July and August. And the one in July, the first one was tested in the Trinity site, but then 2 others were nuclear weapons that destroyed Nagasaki and Hiroshima, killing outright about 200,000 people. Many, many more, hundreds of thousands died afterwards, exposed to radiation and injury due to the wind and air blast that was set off from those weapons. And those weapons were developed, and the plutonium that extracted from them was developed at Hanford. It was created at Hanford. They built 9 reactors around Hanford that were just there to produce plutonium. They mined uranium to go to that material that was used to create the plutonium. So we have an obligation, we have a moral obligation to clean up Hanford, because it's the most contaminated site in North America. And we have an obligation to the people that work there. We have an obligation to the people of the world for the nuclear weapons that we use, the United States citizens used, to the ecological and human damage that was done around Hanford and other sites in the United States, Los Alamos, Savannah River, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, all these sites that use nuclear materials. We have an obligation to those people. We have an obligation to the world about using nuclear weapons and killing many people with nuclear weapons, and really the huge amounts of wasted energy and resources that were dumped in nuclear weapons. We have an obligation to fix that problem, to work around the world to reduce and eliminate, because we have to have the attitude, never again do you want to see nuclear weapons used, never again do you want to see the nuclear weapons stored. We need to reduce, we need to banish nuclear weapons as a material and ban its use worldwide.
And that has been another episode of Down by the River, Stories of Hanford. I wanted to thank Dr. Stephen Gilbert and Dr. Sandy Lawrence. If you are in the Bellingham area, I recommend you look into taking one of Dr. Lawrence's classes. He's a wealth of knowledge and very fun to talk to. And no matter where you are, you can download Dr. Gilbert's book, A Small Dose of Toxicology, for free. It is available in English, Chinese, Arabic, and German. If you want to know more about Hanford, including links to some of the studies and stories mentioned in this episode, you can go to our website, wpsr.org, and then click on the Hanford tab. There you can find transcripts of this show, as well as many ways to stream or download this podcast via iTunes, SoundCloud, or YouTube. You can also check out our previous episode, which looked at the history of Hanford and WPSR's involvement. If you have any questions, comments, or stories of your own, please contact me at daniel@wpsr.org. I hope you tune in next month when we hear from 2 different artists that were inspired by Hanford. Thank you for listening.
Let me just say, so my granddaughter just came in, Hannah, and this is the person we want to think about in the future generations of the world about radiation exposure. So what do you think, Hannah, about radiation?
I don't know.
Do you like the sun?
Yeah. So I can play in the swimming pool.
Do you get radiation exposure from being in the sun?
I don't know.
Yeah, you do.
Maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Well, you know.